Well, hello there. I am Dr. Jen, and this is My Life as a Landlord. Thank you so much for joining me. I am so pleased that you are here for today's show. We are exploring the location-specific tenancy guidelines for New Mexico today, and I'm going to share my screen in just a moment. So if you are on YouTube watching this at My Life as a Landlord, you'll be able to see my slides. If not, all of the hyperlinks are going to be in the description of today's show. Now, you may know in all of my location-specific episodes, I've included a bunch of resources for whatever state, province, territory we are studying. And in this case today, it is the New Mexico Uniform Owner-Resident Relations Act. It's a mouthful, but that's there. Each of my location-specific podcasts is set up in the exact same way, answering the same 4 questions. What are the basics of the tenancy law in that area, in this case, New Mexico? What are the nuances based on the other geographic locations that I've studied? What stands out? What's either missing or not missing, or what's really kind of different? What's also some guidance about abandoned items left behind by a tenant in New Mexico? And then, of course, where to get help in your local area in New Mexico. If you have no idea where to start, where do you actually start? Now, I must tell you that there are more guiding documents than what I'm giving you here. This is not everything. This will just get you started and give you some guidance. There may be other things like city, state, county, city and county items that you may not be aware of that you need to do your own homework. Things like registering your rental. Maybe you need to be licensed as a landlord. You won't know unless you dig more than what I'm going to tell you here. Now, I am going to give you a running start, which is good, but this episode is not all inclusive. You've got to do your own research. All right. Today's episode will get you started. I'm going to give a plug for today's sponsor, Aloha Capital Investments, LLC. If you'd like to know more about real estate investing, check out alohajv.com. All right, let's get into it. The basics of the New Mexico Uniform Owner Resident Relations Act for New Mexico. Give me a sec here. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see, share screen options is, which one? Okay, hang on just a sec with me. I'm going to, I see what I need to do. Hang on, here we go. I'm going to pull my script over and then I'm going to share. There we go. That's what I needed to do. I am capable. There it is. Share. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to look at is in any of the tenant laws that you're seeing, regardless of where you are, whether you're in Canada, you're in the UK, Australia, US, whatever, everything is typically found in some kind of law. So it's very legalistic. And so the first part of what we're looking at today is the legal aspect of New Mexico statutes, chapter 47, property law, article 8, owner-resident relations. So you're going to see on your screen here, you've got all of the sections in chapter 47 that is all of the law part. And so now typically what we're really going to do a deep dive in is the user-friendly explanation document. So, but I have to always make sure that you know that the law part is there so that you can read it for yourself. You can click on any of these hyperlinks. Like, let's just look at this one, use of dwelling unit limited. Okay, so if we click on that hyperlink for that one, it says specifically in here, unless otherwise agreed, the resident shall occupy his dwelling unit only as a dwelling unit and in compliance with terms and conditions of the rental agreement. The rental agreement may require that the resident notify the owner of any anticipated extended absence from the premises in excess of 7 days, no later than the first day of the extended absence. So this is very typical. So that's just an example. All right, so let's move on to the next part. The next part I have is that was the 2024 one. Let me click back. So that was the 2024. That was the updated one. But the 2019 Act is also very legalese. So this is the older one. And this one isn't seem to be quite as user-friendly, mainly because it doesn't have the hyperlinks in it. But what this one has, this is really interesting. Now this is from 2019. I'm recording this in 2025. So this is already 6 years old. This document is 6 years old. But as we scroll down here, if you're watching on YouTube at My Life as a Landlord, you're going to see this. Each section has the purpose. It has it drawn out here. I'm just going to highlight it. And then look at this, judicial decisions. It has the precedence of what the ruling in the courts had been up to that date, right? So even though it's not perfect and it's not, absolutely completely current, that is actually really helpful. I've not seen that in other locations. You have to dig up all the court cases separately, which can be really difficult to see if there was something similar to the lines of whatever you're trying to fight. Now, there's lots of definitions, and I'm not going to go too far into this. I'm just going to show you this next one. Here's some more judicial decisions for this one. Very interesting. So this one's different, right? This one is still the act. This one's still very legal, but it has the judicial decisions in it, which is different. All right, I'm going to go to the next document. Of course, all of these documents I'm showing are in the description of today's show. We're going to go into, this is the renter's guide for New Mexico. Oh, I've zoomed in too much. Let me zoom out. And then there's one more. In fact, the fourth resource for today, I'm actually going to go into this first, and then we'll do the deep dive on the renter's guide. Okay, so this one is only 2 pages long, but it is full of hyperlinks. And what this is, it is the documents for eviction. And so it's for both sides, whether you're a landlord or a tenant, if there's an issue. So let's do petition by owner for restitution. This is the number one question I see on Facebook and social media is, how do I get my money? This is from landlords saying, how do I get my money? So this one is where a landlord can go in. Now I've clicked on the hyperlink, and you would fill this out. So plaintiff, defendant, you would have to fill this out, whatever county it is that you're filling it out. Plaintiff is lawfully entitled to this. So they're talking about possession of the premises. Defendant did this, plaintiff gave written notice, and then the sum of whatever the unpaid rent, damages, whatever it might be. And then you have to file it with the court, of course. But these are the template documents. This is incredible. It's not a sample, it's a template. You can actually print it and use it. So let's just do another one. Order for setting up escrow deposit appeal bonds. And here's yet another template. Very cool. Very, very cool. You just print it off and you can use it. So there's easily at least 15 hyperlinks in here for template documents that you can go straight to court with, which is great. All right, but let's go through the renter's guide. This is where the nuts and bolts of what is in the New Mexico Uniform Owner Resident Relations Act is. Okay, we're going to go in here. Now, of course, this is put on by New Mexico Legal Aid, which is newmexicolegalaid.org. So if you are looking on where to find any kind of resource, whether you're a tenant or landlord listening to this and you want to know more about New Mexico stuff, start here, okay? This is actually a great location. There are much more resources. You're going to see that here in a minute. So as we go through this, you're going to see it's 75 pages as we go through, but it's got all these table of content. These are all hyperlinked. So this, I mean, we're going to scroll through some of this, but this is really, this is a renter's guide. So it's trying to guide renters on how to find a location, finding a place to live, when things go wrong before you move in. Basically, if the landlord's not able to deliver the unit to you for whatever reason, rental agreements, what's the difference between periodic and fixed tenancies, leases, it goes on and on, damage deposits, things like that. Special situations, mobile home parks, housing discrimination, which of course is federal, but the state can do its own aspect of federal as long as it's more restrictive. It can't be less restrictive than the federal. And tenants of federally subsidized housing, tenant organizing, going to court, how this all works. And then this is an interesting one, real estate contracts, renting to own and options to buy. So this is actually helping if a tenant wants to buy the house from the landlord, how that would work. I've not seen that anywhere else. New Mexico is the only place that I've seen that specifically, which is really cool. It also has more forms and model letters, which you'll see, but let's get into this. So there's a bunch of definitions. It goes, again, you're going to see it cites chapter 47 of the act in here quite a bit, which it should, because again, this is the user guide of the act, right? So keeping things on record, finding a place to live. Again, this is guided towards the tenant perspective. The real cost of renting, making sure that you've got all of your, as a tenant, making sure that they're budgeting properly. And if they feel like they're a victim of discrimination. Now, if you've got questions on whether or not you feel as a landlord, if you're discriminating or maybe your ads are discriminatory, feel free, contact New Mexico Legal Aid. They will very likely help you with wording for your ads, or they can give you ideas. And probably, it wouldn't surprise me if they had some documents of what is discriminatory wording or tendencies in marketing ads for units. Help ask yourself, make sure you're protecting yourself if you are a landlord advertising your units. Rental agreements. So periodic versus fixed term tenancies. You've got periodic, and there is an abrupt end to this. So there is a holdover situation. So it doesn't automatically transition to month. Like sometimes leases automatically transition as a part of the lease. In New Mexico, it doesn't. It ends abruptly. And so if the tenant stays, it's considered a holdover. State of Hawaii does the same thing. But in British Columbia, it automatically transitions to month. You don't have to do anything. So, but in New Mexico, it ends abruptly. Okay, oral agreements. Just if you've listened to my show a lot, just don't have anything you agree to in words you need to write down. Form leases. There's all kinds of different ones. Landlords can obtain information about leases from the Apartment Association of New Mexico. Located in Albuquerque. Phone number is 505-822-1114. Online at www.aanm.org. This is a great resource for landlords. Make sure you're taking advantage of all of this. Automatic renewal. We had just talked about an abrupt end, but at this point you can, if you want to in your lease, you can automatically renew. You can also transition, but typically a fixed lease in New Mexico abruptly ends. But in there, the rental agreement should say the rent. What exactly are you renting? Late charges. Now, there is interesting wording about the late fees. Late charges. The late charges cannot be more than 10% of the rent overdue. For example, if the rent is $500 a month, the late payment cannot exceed $50. And the landlord may charge a reasonable fee for return checks and NSF fee. Utilities and appliances, authorized agent. You've got to make sure everybody has contact information for each other. And you'll see as we get more and more into this, there are some locations that take the emergency contact and what I will call next of kin very seriously, because as our rental folks, our tenants in general are aging, we need to be very aware that things happen. People are going to get sick and people are going to have to shift out and people are going to pass away in units. Like this happens. So I do have a episode, if you have not heard it yet, about what to do when a tenant passes away in your unit. All right, back to this. Repairs and maintenance, guest, pets. Now, this is interesting. There's lots of places that don't say a word about pets. So landlord may prohibit a tenant from having pets. If pets are not permitted, a lease should specifically say so. But if they are allowed, the landlord may charge a pet fee, either a lump sum or pet rent in the form of a monthly amount and a pet deposit. But this has to be set out in the lease. So it's got to be very specific. Now, keep in mind, a pet is not a service animal. A pet is not an emotional support animal. I've got lots and lots of episodes on the difference between those animals. A pet is a freeloader. A pet does not have a job. An emotional support animal or a service animal has a job. So make sure you're listening to other episodes if that's appropriate to you. And if you're a landlord in New Mexico, please make sure you are saying whether or not you allow pets. And if you are, you're specific on what is allowed. All right, refundable deposits versus non-refundable fees. Let's see, a deposit is money that tenant pays in advance to protect the landlord, of course. So that's typically a holding deposit. This is in advance of a security deposit, and then you can roll it into either the first month's rent or security deposit. A fee, and this is something that we talk about, is a fee for either an application fee. Let's see how New Mexico defines it. A fee, however, is a charge for something the landlord does for a tenant or the tenants in generally. A landlord, for example, may charge an application fee when someone applies for an apartment. The fee is supposed to cover the landlord's cost of doing credit, background checks, and other investigations to determine applicants' qualifications. Even if the applicant decides to not take the apartment, he or she will not necessarily be entitled to return the fee unless the applicant can convince a court that a fee is wholly unreasonable given the landlord's actually cost. Sometimes the landlords will call that fee is really a deposit, but typically what you'll see in other locations, and as you listen to other location specific podcasts that I'm doing, this application fee, it's got to actually mirror your actual costs. Landlords can't just say, hey, it's $100 for an application fee, and that's going to cover the costs. Anybody that's checking out tenants knows that the fees are somewhere around $50 or $60 or less, and that includes credit checks, criminal record checks, things like that. Then it goes into damage deposit. What's the most that can be charged for damage deposit? It says right here for New Mexico, a landlord may not charge a tenant more than 1 month's rent as damage deposit in any kind. Prepaid rent for the last month is not the same, right? It's all paid with money, but rent and a deposit are not actually the same buckets. So you cannot do that. Let's see, normal wear and tear. It defines normal wear and tear, which is good. Normal wear and tear in New Mexico is damage or deterioration by ordinary and reasonable use of the property. It is the normal loss in value that occurs when something is used. And there are other locations that talk about the age, the expected age of different items like appliances, paint, curtains, carpet, things like that. Let's see, as we go through here, when should the damage deposit be returned? Within 30 days after the tenant moves out, the landlord must make an itemized list of deductions. And basically you've got to prove any deductions. If the landlord does not send both the list and any refund within 30 days, the tenant is entitled to the full deposit, and the landlord loses the right to any compensation. Yeah, this is really important. It tells you exactly, as a landlord, it tells you exactly how to send back the deposit. Otherwise, you're going to be in trouble, and there typically are penalties. Getting the full deposit back, you want to make sure that the tenant signs for it. If possible, send it certified mail. That's typically what I will do. Tenant's duty to pay rent. So this is, whoops, what happened here? Here we go, paying rent. Paying rent versus damage. We've talked about this. Agreements where a tenant's right to a dwelling is tied to a job. So if employment and a job and the employer's renting the unit and they lose their job, they also lose the rental. And then what happens when the tenant doesn't pay rent? So it walks you through how to do this. Now in this, it says like written 3-day notice of non-payment of rent. Well, guess what? In this other document that I'm providing, it says right in here, so here's your 3-day notice of non-payment of rent. Let's actually go through here. Here's the actual template of what you will send, but it tells you how to do it here. And the document is in the other hyperlinked resource that I've sent you. Rent increases. This is always the biggest thing. If the tenant has a written lease covering a specified period of time, like 6 months or 1 year, landlord is not allowed to raise the rent during that period, of course, because you have a set agreement for that time. If a fixed term lease is for more than a month and the lease is automatically renewing, the landlord must give the tenant notice of a rent increase at least 30 days before the current lease expires. Now, that is actually pretty darn quick. I try to do it way more than that. If the lease allows the tenant to renew by giving notice, the landlord must also give the tenant 30 days of a rent increase on the new lease. If the lease runs out, the landlord cannot raise the rent without giving the tenant 30 days notice unless a new lease is signed. And then under a month-to-month rental agreement, landlord must give 30 days written notice before an increase in rent can become effective. And it's interesting because it doesn't talk about how much the rent can be raised. And it also doesn't say how often. So typically, if it's month to month, you can do once a year. A landlord must give 30 days. Yeah, it doesn't say if it can be once a year. And it also doesn't say if there is a limit of what the rent increase can be. But it's just 30 days. That's not very much. If you're budgeting and you're a tenant, you got to really be mindful that that's a very quick notice time. Don't miss your dates, landlords. Don't miss your dates. So this is the obligations of landlords and tenants for safety, maintenance, and repairs. So the tenant has an obligation to keep a clean and safe place, and also complying with the landlord's rules. The landlord, if you have house rules, you have to also give a copy of the rules. And a tenant must allow the landlord to have reasonable access. I think this is actually pretty standard, right? I know there are some tenants who refuse to give notice, but you've got to have, in New Mexico, landlord must give 24 hours written notice. You'll see coming up in some of the locations in this tranche of location-specific episodes that some locations are even faster, that you don't give 24 hours notice. In New Mexico, you do give 24 hours written notice. Very important that you give proper notice. I try to give more than what we need to. And then a tenant must let the landlord know if they're going to be gone for a period of time. So they're saying 7 days or more, using a rental unit as a residence. This is important. Obligations to neighbors. If they're doing illegal conduct and they're disturbing the neighbors' peace and quiet, there is issues with that. Substantial violations, and it has a whole list of things that could include that, which there are some things like sexual assault, molestation of another person, entry into another home's vehicle or home without permission. I mean, the act must take place within 300 feet of the premises of the rental. A tenant does not have to be convicted of a crime to face eviction under the substantial violation provision of the law, but the landlord must still prove that the violation occurred. This is typically going to be corroborated by some kind of a police report, some kind of action. Very interesting, a substantial violation in and around the rental. That's actually quite unique to New Mexico, which is different. What happens if a tenant fails to live up to his or her obligations? Either they fail to pay rent, they do not correct within a notice of 7-day notice of lease violation, 3-day notice of substantial violation. What to do? Notice of termination generally, and then one time on a notice runs out. What exactly do you do? And it walks you through all of this. Repairs. So this is talking about habitability code. So this is about the Albuquerque Municipal Code. Landlord must provide the tenant with properly vented heater, adequate toilet, sink, bathtub, an adequate non-absorbent kitchen sink, 110 degrees hot and cold running water to appropriate plumbing fixtures, working windows or other ventilating equipment, electrical outlets and lighting fixtures, adequate sewage disposal connections. And then it continues. Most cities and towns have laws setting housing standards tenants should check to see what local code requires. Interesting. So this, if there's a repair that the landlord in New Mexico is not doing, then the tenant can give notice. Requests for repairs should be kept and made in writing. And if they refuse to make the necessary repairs, excuse me, then the tenant can take action themselves. But again, they've got to keep records of all of this. And then it goes into what to do when repairs are needed. Three kinds of repairs that New Mexico classifies, which is really interesting. I've not seen this type of repairs like this, not quite like this. So it says those required by something the tenant caused to happen, such as accidentally breaking a lamp or a window. The next is required by normal wear and tear, such as a leaky faucet, stop drain. And then those involving the landlord's obligation to adequately maintain the property, such as faulty plumbing or electrical wiring problems. So tenant caused damage, wear and tear problems, and material repairs. So this is making records. These are, there's actually great lists here, code enforcement offices of many counties, all kinds of counties all over the state. Tenant remedies, there's all kinds of things that a tenant can do, but mainly you've got to keep your written records of it. You can move, you can actually take the landlord, you can deduct the rent as long as you've got proof of it. And so there's an example here. So this one does not have a template per se. I think there's a template at the very back of this, but it gives you an example of the roof in the kitchen leaks. The tenant gave the landlord a written 7-day notice on this day. And it actually just has a whole calculation of exactly what you should be doing and what should be doing. And then there's a rent abatement worksheet. And so it's just a sample. It's not the actual print and go through it, but take a look. And that's on page 32. As we move forward in this is the tenants moving out by choice or by court ordered eviction. This is about giving notice, a tenant giving notice that they voluntarily want to move. Talks about subletting in here, and eviction, retaliatory evictions. Now, this is something that when I'm looking at all these location specific tenancy laws, I am always looking at what each location views as retaliatory action from the landlord. So I'm just going to read through this as it goes. I'm on page 36. If the tenant has requested repairs, ask for a code inspector to examine some problem affecting health and safety of a rental, abated rent, or otherwise properly insisted that the landlord fulfill his or her legal obligations to the tenant, the landlord may try to get a tenant evicted. The same thing may happen if the landlord learns a tenant is involved in a tenants association or has filed a housing discrimination complaint against the landlord. It sometimes happens that a tenant has won a previous eviction action or testified for another tenant in the case against the landlord, and the landlord decides to punish the tenant by filing an eviction action. If any of these things happen within 6 months of an eviction action being filed or any other landlord action being taken against the tenant, the landlord may be acting illegally. This is called landlord retaliation. So you cannot raise the rent, threaten to evict, deny the tenant services, or let's see what else. Yeah, evict a tenant, increase that. Yeah. So it's retaliation. And I'm always looking at the time, how much time has to lapse. And so in New Mexico, it is 6 months. There it is. Okay, illegal evictions, lockouts. Landlords, please be aware you cannot do illegal things. Do not do this. Do not do lockouts. Tenant's property. This is one thing that specifically that I always look at in my podcast. Abandoned property. It is very important that the tenant remove all personal property. However, sometimes the tenant will move out and leave property behind. And so if the tenant abandons the unit, it explains exactly what you're supposed to do. And in layman's terms, what it is continue to try to tell the tenant that you've got their stuff and that you're going to move their stuff. You've got to store their stuff. And there's usually a dollar amount. Below the dollar amount, you can safely discard it. Above the dollar amount, you have to store it, inventory it, and then charge a fee while you're storing it for some amount. Disposition of the property. Here we go. Let's see. Oh, here it is. If the property is worth less than $100, the landlord may keep it or sell it and keep the proceeds. If it's worth more than $100, the landlord may sell it, but the tenant is entitled to any amount over the storage and sale costs. And so it's very specific in here, and each location is very, very specific on what's the amount, what do you have to do, how long do you have to store stuff. Sometimes places need permission. In fact, you have to do this. Landlord, okay, here, hang on a second. Yeah, so here's another one. The landlord, this is in New Mexico, the landlord may not hold the property for security on a debt or judgment without getting formal execution in court. However, if the landlord has stored the property and allowed the tenant to require the required amount of time to claim, the landlord may dispose of the property. So there's several different ways in here. You've got to really understand how this is. Again, if you are a New Mexico landlord dealing with abandoned items and you have questions, make sure you either read this document, reach out for some of the resources that I'm going to give you at the end. One of those is newmexicolegalaid.org. So please make sure you are doing your homework on this, because if you do it wrong, you can get penalized for this. So make sure you've got it right. Okay, tenants in special situations. So this is kind of weird stuff that comes up. You've got what if happens if the rental property sells? What if there is utility problems, making structural changes to the unit, foreclosure? That's actually a new one. This is the first location I've seen that it talks about what happens for the tenant when or if the property goes into foreclosure. Now, in a foreclosure situation, the landlord is no longer in control. The bank then becomes in control. So then the question is, what do you actually do? Because now you're going to be working with the bank. Sometimes you have to move out, sometimes you don't, but it probably won't be a secret if the unit is foreclosed on. Then it goes into chapter 12. This is on page 42. It talks about mobile home parks. The difference between a mobile home park and a regular rental unit is typically the home itself is owned by the tenant. They are renting the land to put the home on. So when you evict someone, you're evicting them from the land, but they keep the home, right? They have to move the home. So that's what's really interesting and what's different, because you're not actually renting them the dwelling. So this is this is different, but it still applies. Evictions for mobile home parks, utility service, a little bit more details here. This talks about housing discrimination. We've actually had quite a few guests on the show about this. If you've got questions about federal fair housing, make sure you are listening to some of these episodes, but just be aware New Mexico and other states and locations have their own housing discrimination as well, which is what this is. Protected classes, national origin, familial status, gender, occupancy limits. This is always an interesting thing. Let's read this one. If a reasonable local building code only allows up to a certain number of people to occupy an apartment, the landlord can refuse to rent to a family of more than that number. For example, if the building code prohibits more than 3 people from renting a 1-bedroom apartment, the landlord can refuse to rent that apartment to a family of 2 adults and 2 children, provided that the landlord would also refuse to rent the apartment to a group of 4 adults or a family of 3 adults and 1 child. Whether the occupancy limit is reasonable depends on the justification for the limit, such as a mobile home park's limited sewer capacity. Some courts have held that a landlord can charge extra rent within reason for children, such as would be charged for extra adults. So occupancy limits is typically how many heartbeats. We call it a being limit. We include pets in there as well. But it just depends on the location. Again, if you have questions about occupancy limit, they're saying local building code in New Mexico is what drives that number for you. So if you have questions about that, again, reach out to one of the resources. Then we're still talking about discrimination exemptions for the Housing Act. Now this, yeah. So some of these for the Federal Fair Housing Act exempt housing providers. So this is really interesting because sometimes you can pick and choose depending on what the landlord owns. So if it's an owner occupied rental building with no more than 4 units and no one in there is subsidized, meaning it's a fourplex, the owner lives in one of the units and the other 3 are rented to non-federally subsidized tenants, then the exemption, there is a Fair Housing Act exemption. Single family dwellings sold or rented without a broker if the owner does not own more than 3 such dwellings, meaning it's not their full-time job. They're just sort of doing it off the side of their desk, but it depends on the landlord. Okay. It also includes religious organizations under limited circumstances and private clubs. Interesting. But it also makes note, says, please do make sure you are adhering to local ordinances and New Mexico Human Rights Act. Okay, talks about statute of limitations, but the most important thing on this page is page 49, talks about the resources available, and there's just pages and pages of resources here. So of course, the first one, as I mentioned at the start, New Mexico Legal Aid, various locations statewide, newmexicolegalaid.org. Make sure that you go there first. And then of course, they talk about U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, Albuquerque Human Rights Office, New Mexico Human Rights Commission. It goes on and on. Applicable laws, so you have all that. Tenants of federally subsidized housing, there are different items that apply for privately owned HUD or subsidized housing or Section 8 housing. So make sure if that applies to you that there is specifics about that. And low income housing tax credit is available. And there are different things that you have to do regarding notice of eviction. So there are changes, there are nuances here. If you're watching this and this applies to you, make sure you're educated in this. Okay, so here's another question. If you're not sure whether you're in subsidized housing, you can usually find out by calling New Mexico Mortgage Finance Authority. The local number there is 505-843-6880. Of course, this is tenant perspective. If a tenant wanted to know, if you're the owner, if you're the landlord, you typically will know. So make sure you need to know which is which. Tenant organizing. If the tenants want to come together and create an organization, this is how you would do that. Remember, this applies if a landlord is trying to be retaliating. You can't retaliate. And then go to court. Now, the biggest thing, this walks you through how to go to court. It also talks again about the documents that you're going to need. So this one, it says petition for writ of restitution. If you go to the second, we've done this before. If you go to the second resource for me, that's called, hang on a second, Resource Guide, Landlord Tenant Law, and it has all the hyperlinks in there. Make sure you have your document printed out that is in here, but it goes through everything in the court. Now, what's not in here, if you have to go to court, there are things that you don't think about, like where do you park? Is there paid parking? Is there underground parking? Where's the front door? What can you take in the building? Because if you're carrying let's say you're carrying a sidearm, guess what? You very likely can't take that into court to even file your documents. So you have to think of that ahead. They very likely will not let any weapons of any kind. So no pocket knives. I had cuticle clippers in my purse. I had to run them back out to the car, and this was in Hawaii. Make sure you do a run through so you kind of know where you're supposed to go, how this is supposed to go before you actually have to file. I know it sounds strange, but when you're stressed out and you're anxious and you're trying to learn, the last thing you want to do is learn while you are appearing to go to court. Do a run through, do a practice run for yourself. Just walk through the motions and say, what's the room I go to? How do I do the metal detectors? All of these things will help you if you have to file, if you have to go to court. Okay, trust me on this. I've done this myself for years. You've got to practice, because otherwise you're just, once it becomes familiar, then it won't be as big a deal. It still will give you anxiety. It gives me anxiety even after 15 years. Okay, so in New Mexico, talking about going to court, talks about legal counsel, definitions, who's who, court procedures, the trial, how this all works. Okay, so you need to go through every bit of this and understand. Again, I'm sure there are webinars and other resources that will walk you through this. Now, remember, this document specifically is tenant perspective, but there are other aspects I'm sure that can help you. This is not the only guiding document for New Mexico, I guarantee it. Trial preparation, trial representation, the judgment, how do you appeal? What do you do after court? Okay, information about the court system is nmcourts.gov, talks about how to do this. The last chapter in this renter's guide is how to do a rent to own and options to buy for tenants who want to buy their landlord's home. And then it goes into resources. Now there's a ton more resources here as you look through. So I am on page, where am I, 64. And there is just tons and tons of stuff. So there's even more help, like predatory lending and mortgage foreclosure. It's talking about if you think you're getting preyed upon, trying to get people to sell, somebody wants to buy your property, make sure you are asking the questions and just pick up the phone and just say, I don't understand what's going on. What services do you offer to help me? They will help you. Okay, and then they have forms and model letters. So some of these are in the hyperlink before that I've been showing to you, but not all of them. Some of them are, so these are like the checklist. So this one is demand letter for return of a security deposit. Obviously that is not a pre-made form that you're going to file with the court, but you still have to have this. So they're different. You need kind of both of them to blend together. So make sure you're looking at all this. The last one in here is the move-in rental unit checklist. And it is, it's just a template. It's not like a print and use type one. This is like an example. So the New Mexico one, this isn't actually the best. There are other locations I've seen, but make sure that you take note on that. Okay, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna stop sharing the screen and I'm gonna go back to my basic script, because I have my 4 points, right? What are the basics? What are the nuances? What about abandoned items? And then where do you go for help? We've covered almost all this, but I want to make sure I've got everything just for New Mexico here. We talked about a tenant application fee. We didn't talk about a grace period for late rent, but we did talk about the late fee amount, security deposits. There are forms and model letters. Did talk about lease wording and pet deposit, pet rent. You can do both in New Mexico. Delivery of a signed lease is required. Condition inspection at move-in is more of a suggestion. It's not required, but as a landlord, you can only prove normal wear and tear or damage outside normal wear and tear if you do a condition inspection up front in writing with pictures to back up, and the tenant and you have signed, or your agent has signed, right? And then at the end, same thing. If you don't do that, then whatever is at the end, the court is going to assume that's what it's been the whole time. So it doesn't help you. Standard wordings or letters, yes, there's pre-made forms. There's also templates. How often is the rent increase? We talked about that. That can be every year. How much of a rent increase? It did not say. And how much notice for a rent increase? It looks like 30 days. Renter's insurance is not required, nor is it mentioned. The fixed lease ends abruptly unless it is automatically converted to a periodic lease in your periodic tenancy in your lease. So there is discussion of a holdover period. We talked about this. Return a deposit is within 30 days. And one thing about New Mexico, it says an owner who in bad faith retains a deposit is in violation, is also liable for a civil penalty in the amount of $250 payable to the resident. So if you keep the deposit and you don't give either the itemized deductions and the remainder of the deposit or an explanation letter within 30 days, not only are you liable for that deposit, you are also liable for an additional $250. So it just pays to make sure you do your homework and you have everything in writing and you understand what your timing is. Can you use deposit as last month's rent? No, you cannot. landlord retaliation, we talked about that. And in New Mexico, you go right to court. There does not appear to be any mediation, although typically the legal aid societies of these different locations will try to have some kind of a mediation option. So I bet that's in there somewhere. Let's see. Nuances in the area. So when I went through this, it was interesting. There were lots of definitions: abandonment, normal wear and tear, a roomer, which is like a roommate. I thought that was really interesting that they call him a roomer, who is a person occupying a dwelling unit that lacks a major bathroom or kitchen facility, and you're sharing. And let's see, here we go. Multi-unit housing, abatement. Okay, I think we've covered all this. Notice of extended absence. We talked about abandoned items and then where to get help. And there's tons and tons of resources here. So I think that we've covered the New Mexico tenancy laws, and the 4 hyperlinks in the description of the show are really going to help you. So just as a reminder, each of my location specific podcasts is set up in the exact same way, answering the same 4 questions. What are the nuances in that area? In this case, New Mexico. What are the basics? And then what are the nuances? Some guidance of abandoned items left behind by a tenant, and then where to get help in New Mexico. This is the same format for every single location. So if you're interested in another geographic area, you know that I'm going to be talking about just in a different location. You already know the format's the same for everywhere. Now, again, I'm going to say this episode is not all inclusive. You must research further in your specific area. If you're in New Mexico, you need to look at your county or your city in your municipality. You've got to make sure you understand the nuances in your geographic area, where your rental is located, not where you're located, where your rental is. But you've got to do your own homework. Okay, so if you're listening to this podcast, chances are that you are either new to real estate or you are wanting to get into real estate in New Mexico. Things you can do to help yourself. Read these documents that I've given you. Go through them yourself. Call your legal aid society, and then check out your local meetup group in your city, county, parish, regional district, whatever is applicable in New Mexico. It is a county, whatever county it is. But jump on Facebook and ask, or Nextdoor, and ask if there is a real estate meetup or a landlord meetup. Jump in there and meet people face to face. Also, you can jump on social media and ask as well. Lots of folks are asking the same questions that you are. If you learned something from today's show, could you please give me a review on whatever platform you listen to this podcast on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or maybe you listen to this at mylifeisalandlord.com. It does not matter which one you listen to, but it does really help if you give me a review. I hope you enjoyed today's show all about New Mexico. Today, I'm recording this episode in San Antonio, Texas. Why? Because real estate takes you places. Where do you want real estate to take you? Join me in the next episode live right now in the library, episode 142, all about the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico. We'll see you there.